You know that feeling when a plan just completely falls apart? Well, today we're going to dive into a pretty radical idea. What if a divine plan doesn't just move forward in spite of our failures, but maybe, just maybe, because of them?
All right, let's jump right in. This promise from the prophet Isaiah, this is basically the foundation for everything we're talking about. And it's such a powerful image, right? God doesn't just remove obstacles or go around them. He literally transforms the obstacle itself into the path forward. Wild. And that's where this ancient text suddenly feels super relevant, isn't it? I mean, we've all been there. We've all faced those mountains in our careers, our relationships, with our own goals, where it just feels like there's no way forward. The path is completely blocked. Okay, so let's start with the big picture here. This universal promise from Isaiah. What does it really mean when we're up against one of those impossible situations? So this promise actually has this really cool dual meaning. On one hand, you've got commentators who see it literally, God physically leveling mountains so Israel could return from exile. But then you have others who see it as a much deeper, more personal metaphor. They see it as God making a way through life's big challenges, the sorrows, and get this, even the obstacles we create for ourselves. The key takeaway is that it's universal. This promise is for every single kind of mountain. But here's what's really crucial, and it all comes down to one tiny word, my. God calls them my mountains. Now think about that. That's not just a power move, it's a claim of ownership. And that simple word reframes the whole thing. It kind of suggests that the obstacles we face aren't just random roadblocks to his plan. Nope, they're actually part of it. They don't catch him off guard. All right, so God can handle any external problem. Got it? But what about when the mountain we're trying to get over is us? What happens when we're the obstacle? Okay, so now let's zoom in a bit. We're going to go from that big universal promise to a really complex, large-scale plan we find in the book of Romans. And here, the obstacle wasn't a mountain, it was the unbelief of an entire nation. Now, to really get what the Apostle Paul is saying here, you've got to understand this image he uses from farming. It's called grafting. It's basically when you take a branch from one plant, say a wild one, and you join it to another, more cultivated plant. So they literally grow together as one. It's a very deliberate process, and honestly, it's pretty unnatural. So Paul uses this metaphor to explain what is frankly a shocking twist in God's plan. He says the cultivated olive tree represents Israel, but some of its natural branches get broken off because of unbelief. And then, in this move he calls contrary to nature, these wild branches, which represent the rest of the world, get grafted in. And the takeaway here is just staggering. The failure of the original branches wasn't just a bump in the road, it became the very mechanism for expanding the whole plan. It's what opened the door for everyone else. The failure became the way. And this just illustrates the main idea so perfectly. What Paul is saying is that God's ultimate purposes, they don't change. Yeah, the plan took a massive detour that from the outside looked like a total catastrophe, but the promise itself was never, ever abandoned. It was just fulfilled in this, wow, completely unexpected way. So we've looked at a huge universal promise, and we've seen a massive national level plan. But this whole idea of God working through failure isn't just for the big stuff. It gets super personal. And there's really no better, or let's be honest, more tragic example of this than the story of Samson. Okay, so Samson, from the moment he was born, he was set apart for a specific mission to start saving Israel from their enemies, the Philistines. His whole life was supposed to be defined by this special Nazirite vow. It had 3 basic rules: stay away from all grape products, never touch a dead body, and never, ever cut your hair. This vow was supposed to be his whole identity. And right there, you have the central conflict of his entire life. It's this huge contradiction between his divine purpose and his own, frankly, reckless personal choices. This quote pretty much sums up Samson's entire life philosophy. His parents warn him not to marry a Philistine woman, and this is his answer. You see, he wasn't guided by God's calling. He was guided by his own desires, by whatever looked right in his eyes. And if you look at the timeline of his life, it's like a checklist of him breaking every single rule. First, he walks through a vineyard. Vow number 1, gone. Then he scoops honey out of a dead lion's carcass. So much for vow number 2. He fights with a donkey's jawbone, breaking that no touching the dead rule again. And then, of course, the big one, the betrayal with Delilah, where he gives up the secret of his hair, breaking the 3rd and final vow. Every single one was a conscious choice to put his wants ahead of his calling. And this is a really crucial turning point in his story. Earlier on, the text keeps saying, the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him. And that's where he gets his power. But once his pattern of disobedience is established, that phrase just disappears. It's like God lets him feel the full weight, the powerlessness of his choices, right up until his very last prayer. So what do we have? We've got an impossible promise, a plan that went completely off the rails, and a hero who basically self-destructed. So how does all of this fit together? Let's connect the dots. Okay, this chart really lays it all out. In Isaiah, the problem was an impossible mountain. What did God do? He made it the road. In Romans, the obstacle was an entire nation's rejection. So God used that rejection to open up salvation for the whole world. And then there's Samson. The obstacle was his own spectacular failure. And God used his tragic end, which was a direct result of his own choices, to fulfill his mission anyway. See the pattern? In every case, the failure didn't just not stop the plan. It became the engine that drove it forward. And all of this leaves us with a pretty deep question to chew on. If a divine plan is truly unstoppable, if it can take even our worst mistakes and weave them into the final picture, then what does that say about how much our choices really matter? It's this incredible tension between God's big plan and our personal responsibility, and that is definitely something worth thinking about.